How do two heavily armed NATO allies, I mean, nations that share the exact same sea, the exact same music, the exact same food, how do they end up in daily military dogfights and this state of, near perpetual hostility?
Right. That is really the defining question of the Eastern Mediterranean. We are talking about a geopolitical fault line that, honestly, it feels more like a bitter, multi-generational family feud.
Yeah.
But instead of arguing over a property line at a holiday dinner, they're arguing over maritime borders, and they're doing it with F-16 fighter jets and heavily armed naval frigates.
It's terrifying, but it's also just incredibly fascinating. So welcome to our deep dive. Today is March 25th, 2026. And you, our listener, are joining us for an exploration that requires a pretty massive geographic pivot right off the bat.
A huge pivot, yeah.
Because just yesterday, we were analyzing the situation in Northern Europe, specifically the Danish parliamentary elections, where exactly as the experts predicted, there was no clear winner.
Right. Total gridlock.
Exactly. That left Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen scrambling, holding talks with multiple parties just to try and cobble together some kind of coalition to keep her government alive.
It was a perfect example of classic, relatively polite, Northern European political gridlock. Everything was done by the book, behind closed doors, in these quiet committee rooms.
Exactly. But today, the compass swings from the far north of Europe to the deep south. We are heading to Greece because today, March 25th, is Greek Independence Day.
It is.
But I want to make a promise to you, the listener, right from the jump. This is not going to be some simple, romanticized sunshine story of freedom and democracy. If you came here looking for a clean Hollywood narrative of, like, good guys versus bad guys, you're going to be disappointed.
Absolutely. Our mission for this deep dive is to give you a profound, impartial understanding of the Greek identity. We really want to unpack how they define their nation, and crucially, why their relationship with neighboring Turkey remains the most explosive, unpredictable, and dangerous conflict within the entire NATO alliance.
And we really need to emphasize that word impartial.
We do. We're relying on extensive and sometimes highly conflicting historical sources to build this picture today. We are not here to be pro-Greece. We are not here to be anti-Turkey or vice versa.
Right.
We're just here to understand the deep structural historical friction that makes the agency a tinderbox. But we also have a responsibility to highlight the reconciling moments between these two peoples because, as we'll see in the sources, there are these powerful moments where the political posturing just vanishes, like during the famous instances of earthquake diplomacy.
Oh, I am so eager to get into that part.
Yeah.
But to understand the relationship today, I think we have to start with the paradox of today's date itself. March 25th.
Yeah, let's start there.
Because as I was looking through the source material, I realized this date is doing a massive amount of heavy lifting for the Greek national identity. Why did they choose this specific day?
Well, because it's doing double duty. It's actually a brilliant piece of nation building. Politically, March 25th marks the official start of the 1821 uprising against the Ottoman Empire. That's your civic celebration. But religiously, in the Orthodox Christian calendar, March 25th is the Feast of the Annunciation.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's the day the Archangel Gabriel is said to have appeared to the Virgin Mary to she would give birth to Christ.
Let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around this. They literally fused the violent birth of the nation with one of the holiest days in their church calendar.
Precisely. The architects of the Greek state intentionally intertwined the Orthodox faith with the national identity from day one. They needed to legitimize the rebellion, so they made the fight for freedom a holy cause. It wasn't just a political revolution. It was framed as a divine mandate.
That's fascinating.
And you see this fusion of faith and state everywhere in Greece, but most prominently in the Greek flag.
Okay, let's talk about the flag, because this is where my mind was completely blown during our research. You look at the Greek flag, the blue and white, the cross in the corner, and if you're an outsider, you probably just think of a sunny vacation in Santorini, right? Like, the colors look like a postcard.
Right, totally.
But the symbolism is intense.
Extremely intense. So let's break down the geometry of it. In the top left corner, the canton, you have a white cross on a blue background. That cross represents the Greek Orthodox Church. And that is crucial because the church was essentially the vessel that kept Greek identity, the Greek language, and Greek culture alive during 400 years of Ottoman rule.
It was the anchor.
Exactly. It was the anchor. But the rest of the flag consists of 9 alternating blue and white horizontal stripes. Now, if you ask many Greeks today what those 9 stripes mean, they'll tell you they represent the 9 syllables of the primary revolutionary slogan, Eleutheria ei Thanatos,
which translates to freedom or death.
Right. Freedom or death. Or, alternatively, they'll tell you the stripes represent the blue of the agency and the white of the foaming waves. But historians look at the primary sources and they point out that a lot of this meaning was retroactively mythologized.
Wait, what do you mean by retroactively?
Well, when the flag was officially adopted by the First National Assembly at Epidaurus in 1822, there was no official decree or written record explicitly stating, we were doing exactly 9 stripes to represent the 9 syllables of our slogan.
Really?
Yeah, the exact origins of the design are much murkier. It was a pragmatic choice that just evolved into a sacred symbol. The deep symbolic meaning was layered onto the flag later, as the new nation needed to build its own mythology.
Okay, I have to push back a little here, or at least, play devil's advocate for the listener. Does the fact that a nation mythologizes its own founding make that history any less real for the people celebrating it today?
That's a fair question.
I mean, I'm thinking about the American flag. We have the mythology of Betsy Ross sewing the first flag, even if historians fiercely debate the details of that story. Regardless of how the stars and stripes were actually chosen, that flag has still draped the coffins of soldiers for 2 centuries. The myth kind of becomes its own reality, right?
That is a brilliant point, and our historical sources actually emphasize this exact sentiment. The construction of a symbol does not invalidate its power. Just because the specific symbolism of the Greek flag might have been constructed after the fact doesn't make the reverence for it fake.
Yeah.
Think about what that flag has endured. It's been flown in bloody liberation struggles. It was torn down by the Nazi occupation during World War II. It was co-opted by a military junta in the 1960s, and it was raised again when democracy was finally restored. It's absorbed 2 centuries of national sacrifice. The myth is just the glue that holds the memory together.
That makes perfect sense. But there is another historical parallel to March 25th that I found absolutely wild in the timeline, and it really reframes how we think about modern geopolitics. March 25th isn't just Greek Independence Day.
No, it's also the anniversary of the Treaty of Rome.
Right, March 25th, 1957. So fast forward from the Greek Revolution in 1821 to 1957, 6 European nations gathered to sign the Treaty of Rome, which is the foundational architectural document of what we now call the European Union.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it's an incredible geopolitical irony. You have 2 entirely different, almost diametrically opposed versions of Europe colliding on the exact same calendar day.
Walk us through that contrast. How are they opposed?
Well, look at Greece in 1821. That represents the bloody, violent, desperate fight for national self-determination. It is the birth of the modern European nation-state. It's all about drawing hard borders, defining who is in and who is out, and fighting to the death to establish absolute sovereignty over a piece of land.
Right.
It's driven by blood, religion, and romantic nationalism.
And then Rome, in 1957, represents the exact opposite philosophy. You have nations looking at the total devastation and the ashes of World War II, and they decide to voluntarily surrender their sovereignty.
Exactly.
They sit in a room and agree to blur their borders to integrate their coal and steel industries so deeply that going to war with each other would become mechanically and economically impossible. It's entirely rational, technocratic, and anti-nationalist.
It is the ultimate tension of modern Europe perfectly encapsulated in a single date. You have the emotional, historical demand of a people to rule themselves, clashing with the rational, bureaucratic need to govern together to prevent another Holocaust. And Greece today is caught right in the middle of that tension.
Oh, for sure.
They are a fiercely proud, independent nation that is also heavily reliant on the technocratic structures of the European Union.
So, to understand why the explosion of 1821 had to happen, why the Greeks felt they needed to rule themselves so desperately that they would choose freedom or death, we have to take you, the listener, back in time. We can't just start the story at the revolution.
No, we have to go back 400 years into the dark.
Right. We need to talk about the period the Greeks refer to as Turkocracia.
The era of Ottoman rule. And to understand this era, we have to start with the trauma that is still permanently etched into the Greek cultural psyche today. Everything changes in the year 1453.
The fall of Constantinople. I know it's a famous date, but put us in the shoes of someone living through it. What did that actually mean on the ground?
You have to realize what Constantinople was. It wasn't just a city. It was the beating heart of the Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantine Empire was effectively the Greek-speaking Orthodox Christian continuation of the ancient Roman Empire.
It had been around forever.
It had stood for 1,000 years. It was the center of their civilization, their religion, their art. And in 1453, it falls to a massive Ottoman siege led by a 21-year-old Sultan, Mehmed II.
A 21-year-old taking down a 1,000-year-old empire. That's just wild.
Yeah. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, refuses to surrender. He strips off his imperial regalia and dies fighting on the city walls alongside his men. His body is never officially identified. And the psychological crowning blow of the conquest happens at the Hagia Sophia.
Grand cathedral.
Grandest cathedral in all of Christendom at the time. Mehmed rides his horse into the city, goes directly to the Hagia Sophia, and immediately orders it converted into a mosque. Christian mosaics are eventually plastered over, minarets are added to the exterior.
I'm trying to imagine the sheer psychological shock of that. It's like your entire center of gravity, the physical proof that your civilization has the favor of God, is just wiped off the board in a single afternoon.
It was a world-ending event for the Greeks, and this ushered in nearly 4 centuries of Ottoman control. Now, this is where we have to fundamentally shift how we think about government, because the Ottoman Empire was not a modern nation-state.
Right.
They did not care about your ethnicity. They did not care if you spoke Greek or Serbian or Bulgarian. They only cared about one thing, and that was your religion.
And this leads to the system they used to govern. The source is called the millet system. How did that actually work? Break down the mechanics of it for us.
Under the millet system, the Ottoman Empire categorized and administered its subjects entirely by their faith community, which was called a millet. The Greeks, along with all the other Orthodox Christians in the empire, so the Serbs, the Romanians, the Bulgarians, they were grouped together into a single legal entity called the Rum Militi.
Which literally means the Roman nation, right?
Yes.
Wait, so the Ottomans let them keep their religion. They didn't force them to convert to Islam.
For the vast majority, no, they did not force conversions. And there was a very pragmatic economic reason for this. The Ottomans were operating under Islamic law, which offered protection to people of the book, Christians and Jews. They were allowed to practice their faith and even run their own internal courts for family law and minor civil disputes. The Orthodox Patriarch in Constantinople was actually made the official political leader of the entire Rum Militi. The Sultan essentially told the Patriarch, "You are responsible for keeping your flock in line and collecting their taxes."
But there's a massive catch. Right, they were allowed to exist, but they were definitely not equals.
Far from it. They were legally defined as second-class citizens, known as dhimmis. They were tolerated, but they were structurally subordinated to Muslims.
What did that subordination look like in, daily life?
It was primarily financial and social. The most obvious burden was the jizya. This was a special extra head tax that you had to pay simply for the privilege of being a non-Muslim and keeping your head on your shoulders. If you were a Christian farmer, you were paying significantly more of your crop yield to the state than your Muslim neighbor.
So the empire actually had a financial incentive not to convert everyone? If everyone became Muslim, the state would lose a massive chunk of its tax revenue.
Exactly. It was an imperial business model. Beyond the tax, there were strict social hierarchies. Christians faced heavy restrictions on repairing old churches or building new ones they could not proselytize. In an Ottoman Islamic court, the testimony of a Christian held significantly less legal weight than the testimony of a Muslim.
Wow.
And in many periods, they were forbidden from bearing arms or even wearing certain colors of clothing that were reserved for Muslims.
That sounds like a heavy, grinding, daily humiliation. But the sources point to one specific practice during this era that goes way beyond taxation or clothing rules, a practice that generated a level of trauma that is just hard to even comprehend today.
You're referring to the devshirme.
Yes, the blood tax. Explain to the listener what this was.
The devshirme was a systemic, legalized abduction program. For hundreds of years, Ottoman officials would periodically travel into the Christian villages of the Balkans and Greece. They would line up the families, inspect their children, and legally confiscate a quota of their healthiest, strongest, and brightest young boys, usually between the ages of 8 and 18.
They just took their children.
They took them, marched them to the imperial capital, forced them to convert to Islam, and then put them through a rigorous, brutal training program. The smartest boys were trained to become high-ranking bureaucrats and viziers who would run the empire's administration. The strongest boys were trained to become the janissaries.
Yeah, those were the elite soldiers, right?
Right. The feared, fiercely loyal infantry of the Ottoman army.
I am trying to process the mechanics of why an empire would do this.
Well, it solves a massive political problem for the Sultan. If you rely on powerful Turkish noble families to run your army and your government, they'll eventually try to overthrow you to install their own dynasty.
Sure.
But if your entire elite military and administrative class is made up of kidnapped Christian slaves who have been severed from their families and their culture, they have no rival noble loyalties. They owe their wealth, their status, and their very existence entirely to the Sultan. It ensures absolute, unblinking loyalty.
That is incredibly Machiavellian. But from the perspective of the Greek parents in those villages, having your child taken away, knowing they'll be brainwashed to forget you, forced to adopt the religion of your conqueror, and turned into a weapon to subjugate your own people, that is a generational psychological wound.
It was horrific. Mothers would reportedly scar their sons' faces, hoping the Ottoman recruiters would reject them for being imperfect. But this brings us to a fascinating contradiction in the source material, because while the Greek peasants in the rural mountains were suffering the horrors of the blood tax and the grinding poverty of the jizya, there was another group of Greeks living a radically different reality.
Yes. I was so confused by this part of the reading. If the Greeks were this heavily oppressed, second-class underclass, how did a specific group of Greeks end up wielding massive, almost imperial power within the Ottoman government?
You were talking about the Phanariots, and their rise is a masterclass in how empires actually function on a practical level, as opposed to a theoretical level.
So who were the Phanariots?
They were an incredibly wealthy, highly educated, cosmopolitan class of Greek aristocratic families. They lived in the Phanar district of Istanbul, which was the neighborhood right around the headquarters of the Orthodox Patriarchate.
And how did they get so powerful?
Through language and diplomacy. The Ottoman ruling class, for a very long time, possessed a kind of imperial arrogance. They viewed European languages, French, Italian, English, German, as the tongues of infidels. They generally refused to learn them.
Okay.
But as the Ottoman Empire began to interact more with European powers, they desperately needed diplomats, translators, and administrators who understood the West, who could read European treaties, and who understood European trade.
And the Phanariots stepped into that vacuum.
Exactly. These wealthy Greek families were sending their sons to study in Italy and France. They spoke multiple languages, so they became the ultimate indispensable middlemen. By the 1700s, the Phanariots effectively monopolized the position of Grand Dragoman, which was essentially the chief diplomat or foreign minister of the Ottoman Empire.
So you have Greek Christians negotiating treaties with foreign empires on behalf of the Islamic Sultan.
Yes, and the Sultan trusted them so much that he even appointed Phanariot princes to rule over the semi-autonomous Ottoman territories of Wallachia and Moldavia, which make up modern-day Romania. So you have this bizarre, extreme duality in the Greek experience.
Yeah, a vast, illiterate peasant underclass hiding from tax collectors in the mountains, and an ultra-elite Greek aristocracy wearing silk robes, living in palaces in Istanbul, and running the diplomatic machinery of the empire that conquered them.
It's a stark contrast. But we can't just look at the peasants and the elites. If we want to understand how a revolution eventually happens, we have to look at the people holding the guns. We have to talk about the clefs and the armatoloi.
Right, because the Phanariots were not going to start a violent revolution. The system was working perfectly for them. The physical capacity for violence remained in the mountains. And the geography of Greece is incredibly rugged. It's mountainous, isolated, and extremely difficult for a centralized state to police.
And that geography birthed the clefs. The sources describe them basically as mountain bandits.
That is exactly what they were. The word cleft literally shares a root with kleptomaniac. It means thief. These were men who fled to the mountains to live entirely outside Ottoman law. They refused to pay taxes, and they survived by raiding.
And they weren't necessarily Robin Hood figures, right?
Exactly. They raided Ottoman tax convoys, yes, but they also raided wealthy Christian landowners. Over the centuries, however, they became romanticized in folk songs as fierce, independent symbols of resistance against the Turks.
And how did the Ottomans respond to these heavily armed bandits living in the hills?
Well, they couldn't send the regular army up every mountain pass, so they outsourced the problem. They created the armatoloi. These were essentially local, legally sanctioned Christian militias hired by the Ottoman state to police the mountains and hunt down the clefts.
Okay, wait, let me trace the logic here. You have illegal Greek bandits fighting legal Greek militias who are paid by the Ottomans.
Yes, but it was a completely fluid revolving door. It was like a mafia-like ecosystem. A man might be an outlaw cleft 1 year, get tired of living in a cave, strike a deal with the local Ottoman governor, and get hired as an armored alloy police captain the next year. And if the Ottomans stopped paying him, he would just go back into the mountains and become a bandit again.
That is wild. But what the Ottomans inadvertently did by creating this system was massive. They essentially allowed a significant portion of the Greek population to remain heavily armed, fully trained in brutal guerrilla warfare, and intimately familiar with the local terrain.
Precisely. For generations, the Ottomans basically subsidized the military training of their future enemies. So by the early 19th century, the dry powder was already stacked high in the mountains. They just needed a spark.
And where does that spark come from? Does it come from the bandits?
No. The spark comes from the outside. It comes from the intellectual wealth of the Greek diaspora. This brings us to the bloody awakening of the revolution itself.
Okay, I want to dig into this because the origin of the revolution sounds like a Hollywood thriller. The spark doesn't even happen in Greece. It happens in the Russian Empire.
Specifically in the port city of Odessa in 1814. We have to remember that this is the era immediately following the French Revolution and the Enlightenment. Ideas of liberty, human rights, and the nation-state are electrifying Europe. 3 Greek merchants living in Odessa become infected with these ideas. They look at their homeland under Ottoman rule and decide it is time for liberation.
So they form a secret society.
Yes, they call it the Filiki Eteria, which translates to the Society of Friends.
I love the mechanical details of this in the sources. They didn't just have meetings. They operated a full-blown clandestine network. They had secret cipher codes for their letters. They had complex initiation rituals with oaths sworn on holy relics. They had secret handshakes to identify each other. They recruited wealthy merchants, priests, and eventually the mountain warlords. Their sole, uncompromising purpose was to organize a massive, coordinated, armed uprising to destroy the Ottoman Empire from within.
And they spent years laying the groundwork. Finally, in the spring of 1821, the uprisings began. The traditional, mythologized date is March 25th, when a bishop named Germanos supposedly raised the revolutionary flag at a monastery in the Peloponnese.
But the reality of what happened next is where the romantic myth of a noble struggle completely shatters.
We have to dispel the fairy tale right now. The reality of the Greek War of Independence was deeply chaotic, fundamentally disorganized, and unimaginably brutal on both sides. This was a war of extermination.
I was actually shocked by how unflinching the historical sources are about this, because normally national histories hide their ugly parts. But the sources detail horrific massacres committed by the Greek revolutionaries.
The most glaring example is the siege of Tripolitsa in the fall of 1821. Tripolitsa was the regional administrative capital of the Ottoman Empire in the Peloponnese. It was a wealthy, walled city filled with tens of thousands of Muslim and Jewish civilians, as well as the Ottoman garrison. The Greek forces, led by a brilliant but ruthless former cleft general named Theodoros Kolkotronis, laid siege to it.
And when the city finally fell, they didn't just defeat the soldiers.
No, the Greek forces breached the walls and unleashed a torrent of absolute, indiscriminate slaughter. For 3 days, they systematically massacred the civilian population. Men, women, children, Muslims and Jews alike were murdered. The estimates are that upwards of 30,000 people were killed.
There is a quote from General Kolokotronis' own memoirs that is seared into my brain. He wrote about riding his horse from the city walls to the governor's palace after the massacre, and he claimed that his horse's hooves never once touched the actual ground because the streets were paved with so many corpses.
It is a horrifying image, and you have to understand the psychology behind it. This wasn't a disciplined modern army following rules of engagement. These were peasants and bandits who had lived under the boot of a foreign empire for 400 years, subjected to the jizya and the memory of the devshirm. When the dam broke, 4 centuries of pent-up rage exploded into a frenzy of ethnic cleansing. They wanted to permanently eradicate the Ottoman presence from the peninsula.
But the Ottomans were an empire. They weren't going to just let a province massacre their people and secede. The retaliation was swift, and it was equally horrific.
The Ottoman state responded with a policy of state-sponsored terror to set an example. The most symbolically devastating retaliation happened in Istanbul itself. On Easter Sunday of 1821, shortly after the rebellion began, the Sultan ordered the arrest of the Orthodox Patriarch, Gregorios V.
But wait, earlier you said the Patriarch was basically an Ottoman official. Didn't he actually condemn the rebellion?
He did. Patriarch Gregorios actually issued encyclicals excommunicating the revolutionaries, desperately trying to prove his loyalty and stop a wider massacre of Greeks in the capital. But in the logic of the millet system, it didn't matter. The Sultan had appointed him to keep the Greeks in line. The Greeks rebelled. Therefore, the patriarch had failed his ultimate duty. They took him in his full liturgical robes after Easter Mass and hanged him from the main gate of the patriarchal compound. His body was left dangling for days before being thrown into the Bosphorus.
That is a chilling message to send to an entire religion. But the violence didn't stop at symbols. The sources detail a military retaliation a year later that completely changed how the rest of the world viewed the conflict.
The Massacre of Chios in 1822. Chios was a very wealthy, relatively peaceful island in the Aegean. The Greek population there was mostly merchants who were hesitant to join the revolution because they had a good arrangement with the Ottomans. But a group of rebels from a neighboring island landed and agitated a revolt.
And the Sultan sent the fleet.
The Ottoman fleet landed thousands of troops on Chios with orders to annihilate. The ensuing massacre shocked the conscience of the entire globe. Out of a population of roughly 120,000 Greeks on the island, an estimated 100,000 were either slaughtered on the spot or captured and sold into the slave markets of the empire. Entire villages were wiped off the map.
And this atrocity is what triggers a phenomenon that I find fascinating. Because up until this point, the major European powers, Britain, France, Austria, they didn't care about the Greeks. In fact, they hated revolutions. They had just defeated Napoleon and wanted stability. But the massacre at Chios causes a massive public relations nightmare, and it gives birth to something called Philhellenism.
So Hellenism literally means love of Greek culture. You have to remember the education system of the European elite at the time. The aristocrats and intellectuals of Britain, France, and Germany were steeped in the classics. They grew up reading Homer, Plato, and Aristotle. They viewed ancient Greece as the very cradle of Western civilization.
So when news of the Greek rebellion spread, they didn't look at it as a messy, brutal Balkan peasant uprising.
Exactly. They completely romanticized it. They looked at the Greeks and superimposed the ancients onto them. They thought, these are the literal descendants of Leonidas and Socrates, and they are fighting for their freedom against an Eastern despotic empire. The massacre at Chios, which was famously immortalized in a massive, terrifying painting by the French artist Eugène Delacroix, galvanized European public opinion.
It was essentially the 19th century equivalent of a viral social media campaign. Committees sprang up in London and Paris to raise money for the Greeks, and thousands of foreign volunteers actually packed their bags and rushed to Greece to fight.
And the most famous of these volunteers was Lord Byron.
I love the Lord Byron element of this story, because he wasn't just a poet, he was arguably the most famous, scandalous, wealthy celebrity in all of Europe at the time. He was a rock star.
He was. And he became utterly obsessed with the Greek cause. He actually traveled to Greece and used his own vast personal fortune to refit and equip the Greek naval fleet. He even took command of a military unit. Now, Byron wasn't a great general, and he ultimately died in the Greek town of Missolonghi, not in battle, but of a fever.
But his death might have been more valuable to the Greeks than his life.
Undoubtedly. The death of the great Romantic poet, giving his life for Greek liberty, made him the ultimate martyr. It locked in the sympathy of the European public.
But here's the crazy part. Even with Lord Byron's money, even with the weapons, the Greeks were fundamentally losing the war. Because while they were fighting the Ottomans, they were doing something incredibly self-destructive.
They were fighting each other. This is a classic dynamic of any revolution. Once you manage to overthrow the oppressor in a specific region, a massive vacuum opens up, and the immediate question becomes, who actually gets to rule?
And the Greeks couldn't agree.
Not at all. You had two deeply opposed factions. On one side, you had the military chieftains, the former cleft warlords who had actually bled to liberate the territory. On the other side, you had the wealthy merchants, the Phanariots, and the educated politicians who wanted to build a modern Western-style state. These two factions despised each other so much that right in the middle of their existential war against the Ottoman Empire, the Greeks fell into two bitter consecutive civil wars. They were literally locking their own generals in prison while the enemy was regrouping.
And the Ottoman Sultan saw this chaos and realized it was his chance to end the rebellion once and for all. But he doesn't send his own army, does he?
No, the Sultan's army had proven ineffective against the Greek guerrillas in the mountains. So the Sultan calls in a massive favor from his most powerful vassal, Muhammad Ali, the ruler of Egypt. Muhammad Ali had built a highly trained, highly disciplined, modern army equipped with European weapons. He sends this army, commanded by his brilliant son, Ibrahim Pasha, into Greece.
And Ibrahim Pasha is devastating.
He was a machine. He lands in the Peloponnese and systematically dismantles the Greek resistance. He doesn't just fight battles. He engages in scorched earth tactics. He burns the olive groves, destroys the crops, and enslaves the remaining populations. By 1826, the Greek cause is practically extinguished. The revolution is effectively over. They have lost.
But then, at the 11th hour, the geopolitical cavalry arrives. 3 massive foreign empires step in. And let's be clear for the listener, they didn't do this just because they read Lord Byron's poetry and felt bad for the Greeks, right?
Absolutely not. Geopolitics is rarely driven by poetry. Great Britain, France, and the Russian Empire intervened because they were playing a massive chess game over the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Greek Revolution was threatening to upend the board.
What were their specific interests? How did the chess game work?
Look at Russia first. Russia shared the Orthodox faith with the Greeks, so they styled themselves as the protectors of the Christians. But strategically, Russia always wanted access to the warm waters of the Mediterranean, which meant weakening the Ottoman control of the Bosphorus Straits. So Russia wanted to help Greece to hurt the Ottomans.
Okay, so if Russia wants to help Greece, why does Britain get involved? Didn't Britain want the Ottoman Empire to stay strong to block Russia?
Yes. Britain intervened precisely to keep Russia from intervening alone. The British feared that if Russia swooped in and saved Greece by themselves, Greece would become a Russian puppet state, giving the Tsar a massive naval foothold in the Mediterranean. France joined in to reassert its own naval power after the Napoleonic Wars, so the 3 empires agreed to send a joint naval fleet to Greece, theoretically just to force a ceasefire and mediate a settlement.
But a mediation is not what happens. The fleets converge, and it leads to an accidental annihilation.
The Battle of Navarino in October 1827. The Allied fleet of British, French, and Russian ships sailed into the Bay of Navarino, where the massive combined Ottoman-Egyptian fleet was anchored. Tensions were incredibly high. A nervous Ottoman ship fired a musket shot at a British boat, killing a sailor. The British fired back. Within minutes, the entire bay erupted into a point-blank naval brawl.
It was literally the last major naval battle in history fought entirely with wooden sailing ships.
And it was a slaughter. The superior gunnery of the European ships utterly obliterated the Ottoman Egyptian fleet. They sank dozens of ships and killed thousands of sailors. The Ottoman capacity to project power by sea was vaporized in an afternoon.
So, purely by virtue of this foreign intervention, the Greeks are saved.
Essentially, yes. Navarino broke the back of the Ottoman war effort in Greece. It forced them to the negotiating table. Without the intervention of the great powers, the Greek Revolution would have failed, and Greece would likely have remained an Ottoman province for decades longer.
I want to pause here and give the listener an analogy to really feel the psychological whiplash of this moment. Imagine you are a Greek revolutionary. You have fought a brutal, terrifying, intimate war for your own freedom. You have lost half your village, you have starved in the mountains, you have fought your own brothers in a civil war, and then right when you are about to be wiped out, 3 massive foreign empires step in, sink the enemy ships, and win the war for you. And then those 3 empires sit around a gilded table in London and say, congratulations on your freedom. By the way, we don't trust you to govern yourself, so we are imposing a 17-year-old Bavarian prince named Otto to be your absolute monarch.
It is a staggering historical paradox. A brutal, grassroots democratic war for national self-determination ends with foreign empires installing a German teenager who doesn't speak a word of Greek to rule them autocratically from a newly built palace in Athens.
How does a nation build a stable identity on a foundation that inherently contradictory?
With great difficulty and with a deep, lingering resentment toward foreign interference. But more importantly, the end of the war left them with an unquenchable desire for more land. Because when Greece was finally recognized as an independent sovereign state in 1830, the borders that the great powers drew were tiny.
How small are we talking?
The new kingdom of Greece essentially only included the Peloponnese Peninsula, a bit of central Greece around Athens, and a few islands. It left out Thessaly, Macedonia, Epirus, Crete, and the massive Greek populations living along the coast of Asia Minor and in Constantinople itself.
So the majority of the Greece nation was still living outside the borders of the Greek state.
Exactly. More than half of all ethnic Greeks were still subjects of the Ottoman Empire. And that geographical demographic reality birthed an obsession that would define Greek domestic and foreign policy for the next 100 years and ultimately end in an absolute catastrophe.
Which moves us into the 20th century, because that geographical reality birthed what the sources call the Megali idea.
The great idea.
I was reading about this, and it doesn't just sound like a political platform. It sounds like a national religion.
It was the secular religion of the Greek state. From the mid-19th century well into the 20th century, the absolute driving force of Greek politics was irredentism.
Let's define that word for the listener. Irredentism.
It is the political goal of a nation to reclaim and occupy land that it considers its lost or unredeemed territory, usually based on history or ethnicity. The Megali idea was the dream to expand the borders of Greece, to incorporate all Greek-populated territories into one massive state. The ultimate, almost messianic goal was to push across the Aegean Sea, reclaim the coast of Asia Minor, and eventually march into Constantinople and resurrect the Byzantine Empire in a modern nationalistic form.
And for a long time, it seems like this wild dream was actually working. Through a series of Balkan wars, Greece kept winning and kept expanding its territory northward and eastward. But the Megali idea meets its fatal, catastrophic end right after World War I.
The Asia Minor campaign, which lasted from 1919 to 1922.
Okay, let's unpack the mechanics of this campaign, because this event is the absolute root trauma of the modern Greek-Turkish relationship. Everything happening in the Aegean today traces back to this. Set the geopolitical stage for us in 1919.
World War I has just ended. The Ottoman Empire had allied with Germany, so they were on the losing side. The empire is utterly defeated, exhausted, and being partitioned by the victorious allied powers, Britain, France, and Italy. The Greek prime minister at the time, Eleftherios Venizelos, is a brilliant diplomat and a fierce proponent of the Megali idea. He looks at the collapsing Ottoman Empire and sees a once-in-a-millennium opportunity.
He sees the chance to finally cross the sea.
Yes. With the backing and encouragement of the British, Venizelos orders the Greek military to land troops in Smyrna. Smyrna, which is modern-day Izmir, was a massive, wealthy, cosmopolitan port city on the western coast of Anatolia. It had a massive Greek population. In fact, at the time, there were more Greeks living in Smyrna than there were in Athens.
So the Greek army lands, and initially they are successful.
Very successful. They secure the coast and then push deep into the arid, rugged interior of Anatolia, aiming to capture Ankara and completely destroy the remaining Turkish resistance. But the Greek leadership severely underestimated a massive shift in reality on the ground.
What changed?
The Ottoman Empire was dead, yes, but out of its ashes rose a fierce, highly organized Turkish national movement. They were no longer fighting for a sultan. They were fighting for their own survival, for a Turkish homeland. And they were led by a military genius, a World War I hero named Mustafa Kemal.
The man who would later be known to history as Ataturk, the father of modern Turkey.
Exactly. Ataturk reorganizes the shattered Turkish forces, stretches the Greek army dangerously thin across the Anatolian plateau, and then launches a massive, devastating counteroffensive. He completely crushes the Greek military lines.
And the Greek army is forced into a chaotic, panicked retreat back toward the sea, burning Turkish villages as they flee. And this retreat culminates in one of the most horrifying events of the 20th century. September 1922.
The burning of Smyrna. As the defeated Greek army evacuated onto ships, the victorious Turkish forces entered the city. Within days, a massive fire broke out. The flames consumed almost the entire Greek and Armenian quarters of this ancient, beautiful city.
And the human toll is staggering.
Tens of thousands of Greek and Armenian civilians perished. They were trapped between the inferno of the burning city and the deep waters of the harbor. People were drowning, they were being crushed, they were being massacred by advancing troops.
And there's a specific detail in the sources that just makes your stomach drop. As this apocalyptic scene is unfolding, there are Allied warships sitting right there in the harbor. American, British, French naval ships are anchored just offshore.
And for a torturous, agonizing period, they did absolutely nothing. They were under strict diplomatic orders from their governments to maintain strict neutrality. They were told not to interfere in Turkish internal affairs.
So the crews of these massive warships literally stood on their decks, listening to military bands playing music to drown out the screams, while they watched hundreds of thousands of refugees crowded onto the waterfront, begging for salvation while their city burned to ash behind them.
Eventually, the sheer horror of the situation forced civilian merchant ships and eventually some naval vessels to begin a massive evacuation, but the trauma was already sealed. It was the absolute, definitive death of the Megali idea. The Greek presence in Asia Minor, a presence that had existed continuously since the days of Homer, nearly 3,000 years, was violently erased in a matter of weeks.
And the political consequence of this catastrophe forces a radical, unprecedented diplomatic solution, because now you have millions of terrified refugees and two nations that hate each other more than ever. This leads us to 1923 and the Treaty of Lausanne.
The Treaty of Lausanne established the modern borders of the Republic of Turkey. But it also contained a protocol that made history. It mandated the first compulsory population exchange in modern international law.
I really want to emphasize the word compulsory for the listener. This wasn't a suggestion. This wasn't a voluntary migration program, meaning forced. You had no choice.
None whatsoever. The international community, led by the League of Nations, decided that Greeks and Turks could never live peacefully side by side again. The only way to prevent future genocide was to surgically, physically separate them. So under the treaty, approximately 1.2 million Orthodox Christians living in Turkey were forcibly deported to Greece, and roughly 400,000 Muslims living in Greece were forcibly deported to Turkey.
Here's where the logistics and the human reality of this treaty are so hard to grasp. How do you decide who goes where? Because the criteria for this forced deportation was based entirely on religion. It was not based on language, and it was not based on ethnicity or genetics.
That is the most crucial and tragic mechanism of the exchange. The diplomats who drafted the treaty used the old Ottoman millet system logic. Religion defined your nationality. If you were Orthodox Christian, you were legally Greek. If you were Muslim, you were legally Turkish.
I want you, the listener, to pause and put yourself in their shoes to truly understand the absurdity and the terror of this. Imagine you are a Muslim farmer living on the Greek island of Crete. Your family has farmed that same plot of olive trees for 10 generations. You are culturally Greek. You speak a specific Cretan dialect of Greek. You don't speak a single word of Turkish. Suddenly, soldiers arrive and tell you that you are being deported to central Anatolia simply because you pray at a mosque on Fridays.
This bureaucratic nightmare.
Or, conversely, imagine you are an Orthodox Christian living in a village deep in central Anatolia. You speak only Turkish, you have never seen the ocean, and you are shoved onto a crowded, disease-ridden boat and shipped to Athens, a city you've never seen where you can't read the street signs or understand the language of the people just because of the church you attend on Sundays.
The logistics of moving 1.5 million people in the 1920s were horrific. People were loaded onto cargo ships where typhus and dysentery ran rampant. Thousands died in transit. And when they arrived, the sheer scale of the crisis overwhelmed the receiving nations. For Greece, a poor, war-torn country of barely 5 million people, suddenly absorbing 1.2 million destitute, traumatized refugees, was an economic and social earthquake.
I read that they were literally setting up makeshift refugee tents inside the Parthenon in Athens.
They put them in the ancient ruins, in theaters, in massive shantytowns that ringed the cities. It created a deep-seated social divide in Greece between the locals and the refugees that lasted for generations. But on a macro level, the population exchange accomplished its brutal goal. It untangled the demographics. It created two relatively homogeneous nation-states on the mainland.
But it didn't solve the geographic overlap everywhere. Because out in the eastern Mediterranean, there was an island that the Treaty of Lausanne didn't touch. An island where the populations were still deeply mixed, and that island would eventually act as the detonator that blew the whole relationship wide open again decades later.
You were talking about Cyprus.
Yes. If the 1922 catastrophe of Smyrna is the foundational historical trauma, Cyprus is the bleeding modern wound. It is the reason the militaries are still on high alert today. How did Cyprus get left out of the equation?
Because in 1923, Cyprus was not controlled by Greece or Turkey. It was controlled by the British Empire. Historically, Cyprus had a mixed demographic. Roughly 80% of the population was Greek Cypriot and Orthodox Christian, and about 20% was Turkish Cypriot and Muslim. They lived in mixed villages all across the islands.
Classic British colonial setup. But eventually, the British have to leave.
Right. After a brutal anti-colonial guerrilla war fought by the Greek Cypriots, Britain finally grants Cyprus independence in 1960. But they don't just hand over the keys and walk away. Independence comes with a highly complex, incredibly fragile power-sharing constitution. It mandated strict quotas for Greek and Turkish Cypriots in the parliament, the police, and the civil service.
And they added a bizarre legal safety net.
The Treaty of Guarantee. This treaty named 3 external nations, the United Kingdom, Greece, and Turkey, as guarantor powers. It legally granted these 3 nations the right to intervene in Cyprus if the constitutional order of the island was ever threatened.
It sounds like a recipe for disaster. Because from what the sources say, the Greek Cypriot majority didn't actually want to be an independent country, did they?
A very large, highly vocal portion of the Greek Cypriot population wanted enosis.
Which means union with Greece.
Exactly. They viewed Cyprus as historically Greek, and independence was just seen as a stepping stone to eventually joining the Greek mainland. The Turkish Cypriots, understandably, were terrified of this. They knew that if enosis happened, they would go from being a protected community in an independent state to a marginalized, tiny minority within a greater Greece.
So they demanded taksim, which means partition. They wanted to split the island.
And this irreconcilable clash of visions destroyed the new country almost immediately. The power-sharing government collapsed. Throughout the 1960s, the island descended into brutal intercommunal violence. Armed militias on both sides committed atrocities. Many Turkish Cypriots were forced to flee their mixed villages and huddle into heavily armed, isolated enclaves for protection. The United Nations actually had to send in a peacekeeping force in 1964 just to stop the slaughter.
But the real explosion, the event that physically broke the island in half, happens in July 1974, and the match that lights the powder keg is struck in Athens.
Yes, this is a crucial turning point. At the time, Greece was being ruled by a brutal, right-wing military junta. The junta's economy was failing, and they were facing massive domestic unrest from students and citizens. They were desperate for a major nationalist victory to legitimize their regime and distract the public.
So they look at Cyprus.
They orchestrate a military coup on the island. They order Greek military officers stationed in Cyprus to overthrow the democratically elected Cypriot president, Archbishop Makarios. The coup succeeds. Makarios barely escapes with his life, and the junta installs a fanatical, violently pro-enosis nationalist as the new leader of Cyprus.
I am looking at the timeline of this, and it is a massive, suicidal miscalculation by the Greek military. What did they think Turkey was going to do? Just watch.
It was pure hubris. Because 5 days later, Turkey acts, citing their legal right under the 1960 Treaty of Guarantee to restore the constitutional order and protect the Turkish Cypriot minority from what they viewed as imminent ethnic cleansing. Turkey launches a massive full-scale military invasion of the northern coast of the island. They codenamed it Operation Attila.
Turkish paratroopers dropping from the sky, amphibious landing craft hitting the beaches. And the Greek junta, the tough military men who started this whole mess, what do?
They completely collapse in shock and shame. The Greek military was so disorganized and hollowed out by political purges that they couldn't even mount a coherent military response to defend Cyprus. The junta falls from power in Athens within days, bringing back democracy to Greece, but at a terrible price.
The damage on Cyprus was permanent.
Absolutely permanent. By the time a ceasefire was finally enforced, the Turkish military had advanced and taken control of roughly 37% of the northern part of the island. The invasion caused a massive, violent demographic shift. Over 160,000 Greek Cypriots fled in terror or were expelled from their homes in the north, becoming refugees in the south. Concurrently, tens of thousands of Turkish Cypriots migrated from the south to the safety of the Turkish army in the north.
And that physical division is exactly how it remains today, over 50 years later. You can fly to the capital city, Nicosia, right now, and you can walk down a bustling commercial street, and suddenly the street just ends.
You hit the green line.
It is surreal. It is a UN-patrolled buffer zone slicing right through the middle of the city. You see rusted oil drums, sandbags, barbed wire. There are abandoned cafes inside the buffer zone where the coffee cups are supposedly still sitting on the tables, frozen in time since the day the fighting stopped in 1974.
And the political reality is just as frozen. In 1983, the North officially declared itself the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. But to this day, it is recognized as a legitimate country by absolutely no one in the world except Turkey.
It's the ultimate symbol of two completely irreconcilable realities. To Greece, to the Greek Cypriots, and to international law, the north of Cyprus is suffering under an illegal, brutal military occupation by a foreign power. But to Turkey and the Turkish Cypriots, the 1974 operation was a legal, moral, and existential defense of an endangered minority that was about to be slaughtered by a Greek fascist coup. They call it a peace operation.
And every single diplomatic attempt to fix it has failed. The most significant attempt was in 2004, when the UN put forward a comprehensive reunification blueprint called the Annan Plan. They put it to a simultaneous referendum on both sides of the island.
And the results were completely split.
The Turkish Cypriots, desperate to end their international isolation and economic embargoes, voted overwhelmingly yes to reunify. But the Greek Cypriots voted an overwhelming no. They felt the plan legitimized the consequences of the invasion, didn't allow all refugees to return to their stolen properties, and didn't provide enough security guarantees that Turkey wouldn't just invade again.
And shortly after that vote, the Republic of Cyprus, representing only the Greek southern half, was admitted into the European Union. So you have a divided island inside the EU. I have to point out the massive geopolitical absurdity of this entire situation. The listener needs to understand the context of the Cold War. How is it mechanically possible that NATO, the most powerful integrated military alliance in human history, designed to present an absolutely unified, impenetrable front against the Soviet Union, just sits back and watches as two of its own heavily armed members effectively slice an island in half, leaving the southern flank of the alliance completely paralyzed?
It exposes a fundamental architectural flaw in how NATO operates. The alliance is built on the assumption that its members will always prioritize the massive external threat, the Soviet Union, or today, Russia, over their own internal historical grievances. NATO relies on unity. But as the Cyprus crisis explicitly proves, when national trauma, identity, and raw territorial security are on the line, local history usually trumps alliance solidarity. NATO has no mechanism to force two of its own members to stop hating each other.
And Cyprus is just one piece of the puzzle. Because the conflict between these two isn't just happening on land, it is literally happening in the water and in the sky. It is a three-dimensional standoff. This takes us to the daily reality of the Aegean chessboard and modern brinkmanship.
If you open up a map of the Aegean Sea right now, you will understand instantly why this is a logistical nightmare. The Aegean is littered with thousands of Greek islands, and the geography is incredibly lopsided. Many major Greek islands, like Lesbos, Chios, Samos, and Rhodes, are sitting literally just a few miles off the coast of the Turkish mainland. You can stand on a Turkish beach and clearly see the houses on a Greek island.
So the geography practically guarantees friction. You have two heavily armed nations crammed into a tiny bathtub.
Precisely. And the structural legal conflicts here are incredibly dense. Let's start with the water. The dispute over the continental shelf and drilling rights. Greece bases its maritime claims strictly on the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, known as INCLS. Under INCLS, inhabited islands generate their own continental shelf and their own exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, out to 200 nautical miles.
I'm trying to picture how that works geometry-wise. If every Greek island gets its own massive economic zone and there are thousands of islands, that must be messy.
Let's use a spectral analogy to make it clear. Think of a country's coastline like a powerful street lamp. Under international law, that light shines outward into the ocean, and whatever water the light touches, you have the exclusive right to drill for oil, catch fish, and extract natural gas. But because Greece owns almost all the islands in the Aegean, they essentially have a string of Greek street lamps sitting right on Turkey's front lawn.
So Greece's light completely blocks Turkey's light. Legally speaking, Greece practically owns the entire Aegean Sea, leaving Turkey, a country with a massive coastline and 85 million people, completely boxed in the dark.
That is exactly Turkey's argument. Turkey refuses to sign UNCLOS. They argued that it is geographically absurd and deeply unfair for tiny Greek islands sitting a stone's throw from the Turkish coast to block a massive continental nation from having equitable access to the resources of the sea.
And we aren't just talking about fish here. We are talking about the recent discoveries of billions of dollars worth of underwater natural gas.
Yes, energy wealth has poured gasoline on the legal fire. But the dispute in the water is actually less dangerous on a daily basis than the dispute in the sky.
The airspace conflict is where things get truly wild. How does the airspace dispute work?
It is a unique legal anomaly. Greece claims a territorial water boundary of 6 nautical miles around its coastlines. But historically, Greece claims a 10 nautical mile airspace boundary above those waters. Turkey looks at this and says, that violates the fundamental principles of international aviation law. Your airspace must exactly match your territorial waters. We only recognize your 6 miles. We do not recognize the extra 4 miles of sky.
Okay, I want to use an analogy here to explain why this causes actual military encounters. It's like you have a house with a 6-foot fence around the yard, but you tell your neighbor, I actually own the air up to 10 feet. So when your neighbor flies his drone over his own yard, but at the 8-foot mark, you claim he is trespassing in your airspace.
That is exactly it. That invisible 4-mile gap between the water limit and the airspace limit is where the military brinkmanship happens. Turkish F-16 fighter jets routinely fly into that contested 4-mile zone, not necessarily to attack, but to physically assert their legal right to be there. They are demonstrating that they do not recognize the Greek claim.
And how does Greece react when Turkish jets cross that invisible line?
They cannot let it go unchallenged. or they risk losing the legal claim through precedent. So Greek F-16s immediately scramble from their island bases to intercept the Turkish jets and chase them out.
And we are talking about armed aircraft.
Fully armed, they engage in high-speed, highly dangerous mock dogfights. They pull high-G maneuvers, they try to get on each other's tails, and they actually lock their missile-targeting radars onto each other. This isn't a rare occurrence. This happens hundreds, sometimes thousands of times a year.
It's absolute madness. It's like two guys walking around a crowded bar, constantly bumping chests, hovering a millimeter away from throwing a punch, just waiting for the other guy to flinch. And the terrifying part is sometimes they do throw a punch. Sometimes the chest bumping escalates. Let's talk about 1996.
The EMEA crisis, or as the Turks call it, the Kardak crisis. This is perhaps the most surreal, terrifying near-war scenario in modern NATO history. And it was fought over two tiny, completely uninhabited rocks in the middle of the Armenia.
When you say rocks, you don't mean small islands.
I mean literally just outcroppings of stone that only goats live on. In late 1995, a Turkish cargo ship ran aground on one of these rocks. A dispute immediately erupted over who had the jurisdiction to tow the ship off the rocks. Was it Greek territory or Turkish territory? It was one of many gray zones where sovereignty was ambiguously defined in older treaties.
It sounds like a minor bureaucratic headache for the Coast Guard. How does it escalate into a war?
Through the media. A group of Greek journalists, fueled by nationalist fervor, took a small boat out to the rocks, brought a television camera, and defiantly hoisted a Greek flag. A few days later, a group of Turkish journalists from a rival newspaper flew out to the rocks in a helicopter, took down the Greek flag, and broadcast themselves hoisting a Turkish flag.
Which sounds like a silly, provocative media stunt, a battle of the tabloids. But then the politicians get involved, and they can't afford to look weak.
Exactly. National pride was now on the line. The militaries of both nations were mobilized. Greek and Turkish naval warships rapidly converged on these two tiny rocks, aiming their guns at each other. On the night of January 30th, 1996, under the cover of darkness, heavily armed Greek naval special forces landed on one of the rocks. A few hours later, Turkish commandos infiltrated and landed on the other rock.
You have the most elite killers of two NATO countries sitting on adjacent rocks in the pitch black, fingers on the triggers, waiting for an order.
The tension was at an absolute breaking point. And then tragedy struck. A Greek military helicopter flying a reconnaissance mission over the rocks malfunctioned and crashed into the churning sea, killing all three Greek officers on board.
If the Greeks had thought the Turks shot that helicopter down, war would have started that exact second.
War was minutes away. The fleets were ready to fire. It was stopped only by frantic, midnight diplomatic intervention by the United States. U.S. diplomats, including Richard Holbrooke, literally had to get on the phone with both prime ministers and force them to simultaneously withdraw their forces. The phrase used was, no ships, no troops, no flags.
They pulled back from the brink, but they never actually solved the underlying issue. Those gray zones are still disputed today, and the rhetoric has only escalated since then. Let's look at the modern era, because the threats have been formalized into law. What happened in 1995?
In 1995, the Turkish parliament officially passed a casus belli resolution. A casus belli is a formal, legal declaration of a cause for war. The Turkish parliament explicitly stated that if Greece ever decides to expand its territorial waters from 6 miles to 12 miles, which, by the way, Greece has every legal right to do under the UN Convention, Turkey will consider it a direct act of war and will respond with military force.
Because expanding to 12 miles would effectively turn the Aegean into a closed Greek lake, cutting off Turkish shipping lanes from reaching international waters.
Yes, and more recently, under President Erdogan, Turkey has pushed a highly aggressive naval doctrine called Mavi Vatan, which translates to Blue Homeland. It is a doctrine that claims a massive maritime zone across the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean for Turkey, completely ignoring the economic zones generated by major Greek islands like Crete or Rhodes.
And it isn't just about water and airspace anymore. It bleeds into culture and politics. In 2020, President Erdogan officially converted the Hagia Sophia, which had been functioning as a secular museum since the 1930s, back into a working mosque. For the Greeks, seeing Islamic prayers broadcast from the heart of their ancient Byzantine cathedral was a deeply offensive provocation. Then you have the weaponization of migration, where Turkey periodically threatens to open its borders and flood Greece with refugees to extract concessions from Europe. You have Turkey buying advanced S-400 anti-aircraft missiles from Russia, infuriating Greece and the rest of NATO.
It is a multifaceted, constant pressure campaign designed to force Greece to the negotiating table on Turkey's terms.
Which brings me back to my question about NATO. It's the elephant in the room. Article 5 of the NATO treaty is the sacred bedrock of the alliance. It says an armed attack against one member is considered an attack against all members. So what on earth happens if a Greek and Turkish jet actually collide, or a ship fires a missile? If Greece and Turkey go to war, who does NATO defend?
It is the ultimate nightmare scenario, the paradox of the alliance. Technically, if they went to war, both nations would likely invoke Article 5 simultaneously, claiming the other shot first. In practice, the NATO bureaucracy would be totally paralyzed. NATO tries desperately not to take sides because it strategically relies on the military infrastructure of both countries to secure the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. If forced to choose, it would shatter the alliance. So NATO's only strategy is relentless diplomatic pressure to keep them from pulling the trigger.
It is a delicate, terrifying balance. But while the military's posture in the Aegean and the politicians shout at each other in Brussels and Ankara, there is a whole other layer to this conflict that is deeply personal and rarely makes the headlines. Because there are actual human beings caught behind enemy lines on both sides. Let's talk about the people left behind.
We need to revisit the 1923 population exchange. When they forcibly deported 1.5 million people based on religion, there were two specific populations that were explicitly exempted from the exchange. They were allowed to stay in their ancient homes.
The Greeks living in Istanbul and the Muslims living in Western Thrace, in northern Greece.
Exactly. And the tragic reality of the last century is that these two populations essentially became diplomatic hostages. Their safety and their rights were entirely dependent on how well the two governments were getting along. Let's start with the Greeks in Istanbul, because that is a story of a thriving community being systematically, intentionally erased.
Paint a picture of what the Greek community in Istanbul looked like in the 1920s, after the treaty.
It was robust. There were over 100,000 Greeks living in Istanbul. They were an affluent, highly educated, cosmopolitan part of the city's fabric. They ran businesses, they had flourishing schools, newspapers, and of course they had the Orthodox Patriarchate. But the turning point, the beginning of the end for this community, came in September 1955.
The pogroms, the event the Greeks call Ta Septembriana.
Yes. The context is important here. In 1955, the Cyprus crisis is just starting to heat up. Tensions are rising. And suddenly, a rumor explodes across Istanbul. News reports hit the radio and the evening papers claiming that Greek terrorists had planted a bomb at the Turkish consulate in Thessaloniki, Greece, which happened to be the historic birthplace of Ataturk.
But the sources confirmed this was entirely fake news, right?
It was a fabricated pretext. But it worked perfectly. In response to the news, massive, highly organized mobs took to the streets of Istanbul. And I emphasize organized. This wasn't a spontaneous riot. Trucks appeared in the city, dropping off thousands of men armed with pickaxes and crowbars. They were handed lists of Greek addresses. For 2 days, they systematically attacked the Greek districts of the city.
The logistics of the destruction detailed in the sources are staggering. They destroyed thousands of Greek-owned shops, pulling the merchandise into the streets and burning it. They burned dozens of historic Orthodox churches to the ground. They even went into the Greek cemeteries, dug up the graves, and desecrated the bones of the dead.
It was a state-sponsored message of terror, and it broke the back of the Greek community's sense of security. Thousands fled immediately. But what the 1955 pogroms started, the Turkish state finished through bureaucratic cruelty a decade later.
In 1964.
Yes. In 1964, there was another violent flare-up in Cyprus. In retaliation, the Turkish government abruptly canceled a residency treaty and ordered the mass deportation of over 10,000 Greek citizens living in Istanbul.
The cruelty of how this was executed is heartbreaking. The sources say these people were given 48 hours to leave a city their families had lived in for generations.
And they were financially ruined on the way out. They were legally allowed to take only a single 20-kilogram suitcase of clothes and the cash equivalent of $22. Everything else, their homes, their businesses, their bank accounts, was confiscated by the state.
People who had built their entire lives in Istanbul were suddenly dumped in Athens with nothing, forced to start over, and the long-term result. Today, out of that vibrant community of 100,000, there are only a couple of thousand elderly Greeks left in Istanbul. The community was virtually extinguished.
No, we have to look at the mirror image of this hostage dynamic. Look at the Muslim minority in Western Thrace, in Greece.
Who are they, exactly? Because the sources say it is not a monolithic group.
They number around 100,000 people today. It is a highly complex, multi-ethnic group. It includes people of Turkish descent who fiercely identify as Turks. But it also includes Pomaks, who are a Slavic-speaking Muslim population, and a large population of Muslim Roma. However, the 1923 treaty simply grouped them all together as the Muslim minority.
And how did the Greek state treat this minority? Did they treat them better than Turkey treated the Greeks in Istanbul?
For decades, the Greek state treated them terribly. From the 1950s well into the 1990s, Greece viewed this population with extreme suspicion, treating them as a potential fifth column of Turkish spies. They subjected them to severe administrative discrimination. If you were a Muslim in Thrace, it was incredibly difficult to get a permit to buy a house, repair a mosque, get a license to drive a tractor, or open a business. You were effectively blocked from entering the civil service.
It was a policy of deliberate economic suffocation to encourage them to leave.
Exactly. It wasn't until the 1990s, under heavy pressure from the European Union, that Greece finally lifted many of these discriminatory laws and established a policy of equality before the law. But massive structural tensions remain today, particularly over the issue of religion and leadership.
The Mufti dispute. I found this mechanically fascinating because it creates a legal paradox. Under the 1923 treaty, this Muslim minority in Greece is legally allowed to use Islamic Sharia law to settle family matters like inheritance, marriage, and divorce.
Which creates an insane anomaly. Greece is the only country in the European Union that legally applies Sharia law to a segment of its citizens.
But the fight isn't over the law itself. The fight is over who gets to pick the judges, the muftis. How does this dispute work?
The Greek government insists on appointing the muftis. Greece argues that because these muftis wield actual judicial power over Greek citizens, they are effectively state officials, and therefore the state must select them, just like they select regular judges.
But the Turkish identifying minority rejects that completely.
They demand the right to elect their own religious leaders. And the Turkish state heavily backs them. Turkey actually funds unofficial elected muftis and builds unofficial mosques in Thrace. So you have this constant grinding diplomatic arm wrestling match between Athens and Ankara over the daily spiritual lives of 100,000 farmers and shopkeepers in northern Greece.
It all comes back to the grand treaties made by men in suits in 1923. They completely failed to protect the actual human beings who were left behind as exceptions. These people just became bargaining chips. If you mistreat our people in Thrace, we will squeeze the patriarchate in Istanbul.
It is the brutal, unforgiving logic of diplomatic reciprocity. And before we leave the realm of history and trauma, we must briefly mention a history that is completely denied by one side, which makes reconciliation almost impossible: the fate of the Pontic Greeks.
Right, the Greeks of the Pontus. These were communities who had lived along the Black Sea coast of Anatolia, far away from the Aegean, for 2.5 millennia. What happened to them?
During World War I and its immediate aftermath, running concurrently with the Armenian genocide, the Pontic Greek population was subjected to a horrific campaign by the collapsing Ottoman state and later the Turkish nationalists. They were targeted with mass deportations, forced labor battalions, death marches into the freezing mountains of the interior, and outright massacres. An estimated 300,000 to 360,000 Pontic Greeks perished.
And the terminology around this is highly explosive today.
Yes, the Greek state and the descendants of the survivors in the diaspora officially recognize and commemorate this as a genocide. They view it as a systematic attempt to exterminate their race. The Republic of Turkey, however, categorically denies the term genocide. The official Turkish position is that these deaths were the tragic but inevitable casualties of a brutal, multi-sided intercommunal war where all populations, Muslims and Christians alike, suffered terrible losses from disease, starvation, and rebel violence. This total denial remains a source of immense, unhealed, visceral trauma for Greeks today.
So if we look at the ledger we've built, we have massacres, pogroms, deported minorities, genocide accusations, military dogfights, and a violently divided island. If you just look at the politics and the military, it sounds utterly hopeless. It sounds like they should be at war tomorrow. But this is exactly why we have to pivot, because the politics is only half the story. Despite the hostage-taking and the standoffs, on a human cultural level, the line between Greek and Turk is beautifully, wonderfully, inextricably blurred.
It is the great paradox of the region. You cannot live side by side, sharing the same land, the same climate, and the same empire for nearly 1,000 years without absorbing each other's soul. The cultural intertwining is profound and undeniable.
Let's start with the most obvious, tangible example, the food. If you sit down at a traditional taverna in Athens or a meyhane in Istanbul, you are basically eating the exact same meal.
The culinary DNA is identical. You have baklava, you have stuffed vine leaves, which the Greeks call dolmades and the Turks call dolma. You have the yogurt and cucumber dip tzatziki in Greece, keshik in Turkey. You have moussaka, Now, of course, if you sit a Greek and a Turk at that table, they will passionately, fiercely argue over who actually invented the dishes and who stole the recipe from whom. But the palate, the ingredients, the way the food is meant to be shared over hours of conversation, that is a shared cultural language. And that shared language extends directly into the music. Let's look at rebetiko. It is often called the Greek urban blues. It is a soulful, melancholic style of music that is considered quintessentially, authentically Greek today. But where was it born? It was essentially born in the slums of Athens and Piraeus in the 1920s, created by the desperate, impoverished refugees who had just been expelled from Smyrna in Anatolia.
The people who survived the fire.
Yes, they brought the musical scales, the microtones, and the instruments of the East, like the bouzouki and the baglama, with them. If you listen to a classic Greek rebetiko song and then you play a classic Turkish arabesque song, the untrained ear can barely tell the difference. They are musical twins separated by a political border. They sing about the same heartbreak, the same poverty, the same longing.
And you see this blurring not just in the art, but in the people themselves. The sources highlight a fascinating group, the Turco-Cretans.
A perfect example of how inadequate national borders are at capturing human reality. During the 1923 population exchange, thousands of Muslims living on the Greek island of Crete were forcibly deported to Turkey. But remember, these people were culturally Cretan. Many of them spoke a specific dialect of Greek as their absolute first language. They had Cretan customs.
So they arrive in Turkey, the country that is supposedly their true homeland, and they are treated as complete outsiders. The locals look at them and say, "You speak Greek, you act Greek, you aren't one of us." And the resilience of this culture is amazing. For generations after moving to Turkish coastal towns like Bodrum, these families continued to speak the Cretan Greek dialect inside their homes. They continued to cook Greek-style food. They continued to sing Greek folk songs, even while living as official Turkish citizens. They were legally Turkish Muslims, but culturally, they carried Greece with them.
And this shared humanity, this undeniable underlying connection, bubbles up to the surface in the most desperate, terrifying times. This brings us to a phenomenon that offers the most hope for the region. We have to talk about earthquake diplomacy.
The geology of the region forces them together just as much as the geography divides them. Both Greece and Turkey sit on massive, highly active seismic fault lines. In the late summer of August 1999, a massive, catastrophic earthquake struck near Istanbul and the Marmara region of Turkey. Over 17,000 people were killed. The devastation was apocalyptic.
And what did the Greek government, their historical blood enemy, do? Did they gloat? Did they take advantage?
They did the exact opposite. Greece was the very first nation to send emergency rescue teams. Greek disaster relief workers, doctors, and firefighters flew into Turkey immediately. The visual impact of this was monumental. You had Turkish television broadcasting live footage of Greek rescue workers physically digging through concrete rubble, risking their own lives to pull Turkish children out alive.
I can't even imagine the emotional impact of seeing that on the evening news after decades of being told the Greeks are the enemy.
It broke the ice in a way no diplomat ever could. And then, in an incredible twist of fate, just weeks later in September 1999, a major earthquake hit the suburbs of Athens.
And Turkey returned the favor.
Immediately. Turkish rescue teams, the Acute Search and Rescue Unit, flew to Athens to dig Greeks out of the debris. The Turkish public donated massive amounts of blood and funds. This mutual tragedy led to a profound, immediate thaw in diplomatic relations. It paved the way for a period of relative calm and cooperation that lasted for years.
And the incredible thing is, this wasn't a one-off historical anomaly, because we literally just saw a repetition of this in 2023. When the apocalyptic earthquakes hit southeastern Turkey and Syria, killing tens of thousands, who was the first foreign team on the ground. The Greek EMAC rescue unit. You had images of Greek and Turkish rescuers hugging each other and crying together over a pulled survivor.
It proves that beneath the toxic nationalism, beneath the casus belli and the EEZ disputes, they recognize each other as human beings.
Think about how powerful that is for you, the listener, to conceptualize. Politicians and generals can declare you blood enemies. They can pass resolutions in parliament threatening war. They can fly F-16s at each other. But when the ground literally shakes and your apartment building falls on your family, it is the enemy who crosses the border to dig you out of the rubble.
It is a profound truth. However, as we synthesize all of this, we must note a massive, fundamental psychological asymmetry in how these two nations view each other on a daily basis. The relationship is not balanced.
What do you mean by asymmetry? How do they see each other differently?
Let's look at Greece first. For Greece, Turkey is what sociologists call the constituting other, meaning the modern Greek nation was literally born by fighting the Turkish Empire. The core of their historical narrative is resistance against the Turk. Turkey is baked into the very DNA of the Greek identity. From the flag to their Independence Day today to their military budget, Turkey is always constantly on the Greek mind.
They are hyper-aware of this giant neighbor hovering to the east. It dominates their foreign policy.
Exactly. But if you cross the Aegean and look at it from Ankar's perspective, the view is entirely different. For Turkey, Greece is just one of many neighbors. Turkey is a massive nation of 85 million people. They see themselves as a major regional, even global power. Their foreign policy is focused on managing complex, dangerous relationships with Russia, with Iran, dealing with the wars in Syria and Iraq, and projecting influence into the Middle East and Africa.
So where does Greece fit into the Turkish worldview?
To the Turkish establishment, Greece is often viewed as a small, somewhat annoying neighbor that constantly tries to use its membership in the European Union and its lobbying power in the United States to punch above its weight class and constrain Turkey's natural expansion as a great power. Greece obsesses over Turkey, but Turkey is very often looking the other way.
That is a brilliant way to frame the tension. Okay, let's bring this all together. We have looked at 400 years of the millet system and the devshirme. We've looked at the bloody, chaotic revolution of 1821. We've traced the catastrophic population exchanges of 1923, the tragedy of a divided Cyprus, and the daily hyper-technical dogfights over airspace and maritime zones in the Aegean. So, what is the grand takeaway? Where does this leave us today?
It leaves us with a fragile, highly managed reality. The relationship between Greece and Turkey is not a math problem. It cannot be neatly solved with a single, clever treaty drawn up by diplomats in Geneva. It is a chronic condition. It is a situation to be managed.
How is it managed?
It relies on a delicate, constantly shifting web of mutual military deterrence. It relies on the awkward, paralyzing umbrella of the NATO alliance, forcing them to the same table. But most importantly, it relies on the genuine underlying preference of both populations to enjoy their shared food, their shared music, and their tourist economies in peace, rather than risk the absolute devastation of war.
It's a family feud that has to be kept at a low simmer forever. Because if it boils over, it burns the whole house down. And before we go, we want to leave you, the listener, with a final, lingering thought drawn from our sources, something to ponder the next time you look at a map of the Eastern Mediterranean.
Consider the massive butterfly effect of today's date. The Greek Revolution of 1821 wasn't just the birth of modern Greece. It was the very first major internal domino to fall in what would become a brutal 100-year collapse of the massive Ottoman Empire.
Exactly. The Greeks proved that the empire could be defeated from within. They cracked the foundation. And without the Greek uprising cracking that empire open, sparking the waves of nationalism that eventually brought the whole structure down, the modern secular Republic of Turkey might never have been built by Ataturk on the empire's ruins.
It is a profound historical irony. What if these two bitter, heavily armed rivals are actually twins? Twins born from the exact same violent century of imperial collapse. What if they actually needed each other's existence and each other's opposition to figure out exactly who they are?
It's a powerful way to look at their intertwined destiny. So remember our analytical mission from the beginning. If you try to look at Greece and Turkey with a clean, simple, binary lens of absolute right and absolute wrong, the lens shatters. You're looking at a landscape of muddy, overlapping historical traumas, incredible geopolitical chess games, and profoundly shared souls. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you look at the map of the Aegean Sea with entirely new eyes. We'll see you next time.